Welcome back for the first time to the mysteriously growing and portable Indie Comic Vault. Before I jump into my first thing, I just want to say Indie Comic Vault is essentially me covering non-traditional, non-mainstream comics. Uh, Basically, just things that aren't from Marvel or DC. Because Cap is always talking about how he wishes he read more of that stuff. So when he said he wanted more content on the channel, I was like, oh well, I read a bunch of that stuff. I'll do that. So indie is a really broad, vague term for this series. So I'm probably going to cover books that people could argue are not indie comics, and that's totally fair. This is really non-mainstream comic book vault didn't sound as good. So I had a couple of different things that I was thinking about doing for my first indie vault, but then I was like, oh, you know what? I've never read A Contract with God. I should do A Contract with God as my first indie vault. That would be great. A Contract with God, for those that don't know, uh, is a book by Will Eisner that is referred to as and largely regarded as the first graphic novel. Um, and I was really interested in reading it. And then, much to my surprise, I discovered I don't know if I would actually classify this as the first graphic novel. Um, Now, it's regarded as the first graphic novel because it is the first time a comic was published straight to book form, uh, with a large page count. So by that definition, it certainly is the first graphic novel. However, to my surprise when I went to read it, it is actually four stories. Um, and that kind of surprised me. Like that would be like saying The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes is the first full-length novel, or Creepshow is the first feature-length film. I understand that both those references don't specifically make sense because there were things before them. I just picked two random anthology things off the top of my head. Um, but yeah, so that surprised me. I was expecting this to be a singular story, and it's not. It's four stories. And as we go through, there's no real way to talk about this book without just going through each story. And the stories are so short, I'm basically just going to have to give you a synopsis to have any understanding of what I'm talking about. So, spoilers ahead. Um, my big thing with all of these stories, except for maybe the last one, is that all of these stories felt like they should have been longer. Given that this is the first time an artist just sat down and said, you know what, I'm just going to take as many pages as I need to take to tell these stories, uh, pretty much all of them feel like they should be longer. They're non-traditional narratives for the most part. They don't really end as much as they stop, and oftentimes it feels like they should go on longer, or some of them feel like they should keep going, like they aren't the full story, but some of them also feel like there should be more just in the story because it doesn't feel complete, and I'm not really sure I'm getting the full. I don't feel like I'm fully understanding what Will Eisner is trying to say with some of these stories. Uh, so, without further ado, so the first story is the titular "A Contract with God." This story basically tells the story of a rabbi whose daughter has just died, and we find out that when he was younger, he was a really great person, and every time he did something good to help somebody else, uh, always selflessly, people would tell him, "Oh, God's gonna bless you. God is going to, look favorably upon you in life." And so he makes this contract with God, like a literal contract on a stone, with God that says, I'm going to do good things, and you're going to reward me. And then in the present, he's now an old man. He has adopted this woman, or sorry, this girl who has just recently died. Um, he adopted her when she was a little girl. She was a little bit older when she died. And he has this real crisis of faith where he's like, now hold on a second. If I'm supposed to live by the word of God and accept everything that accept all these rules, then you have to play by the rules too. We had a contract, and my contract said, I do good things will happen to me, and my daughter just died. So he shaves off his beard. He essentially leaves the faith entirely. He takes a bunch of bonds from the temple, and he uses them as collateral, and he starts buying buildings. And he basically becomes a massive entrepreneur who owns a good portion of this area of the city. And he owns the buildings, and then he sells them, or he has them completely rebuilt, except for one building, which is the building that he lived in, which is the building that all of these stories kind of take place in. Like, that's the through line. There's no real characters that reoccur through any of these stories, but they all take place in this same building, I think. I'll get to that in the second story, but I'm pretty sure the idea is that they all take place in the same building. And he keeps this building. He never sells this building. He never knocks it down and renovates it and all this stuff. He kind of protects this one building. And then, after a few years, he's built up all this money. He goes to these rabbis, and he says, here's all of the money that I used. You guys didn't even know, but I used all these bonds. Here's payment back for all the bonds with interest. Now, what I want from you is for you to write me a new contract with God, an airtight contract. And so the rabbis agree, a little hesitantly, but they do agree to do it. And so he gets this new contract, and he's super, super excited. I have this contract with God. I will be a good person again. I will do good things again. And then he dies. And then a boy finds, earlier in the story, when he gets angry, he takes the stone that he wrote the contract on, and he throws it out the window. At the end of the story, a boy finds that contract, and the boy is very similar to... is very similar in that he does good things. Like we see him do something good, and then he's told, like, oh, God's gonna look favorably upon you. And that's kind of how the story ends, and I'm really left wondering what I'm supposed to get from the story. Because at first I thought, I think the idea is that, like, you can't hold God accountable, and that you should do good things regardless. You should just be a good person. You shouldn't just do it because that's what you're supposed to do, because that's what God tells you to do. You should be a selfless person and do it because it's the right thing. I think that's what the, I guess, moral of the story is supposed to be, but as it's presented, I'm not really clear. Because it seems like all along he was, at least as he got older, he was really just kind of a good person because he thought God and him had this deal. And then when he gets rid of his contract, he doesn't become a bad person. He becomes more miserly and more worldly, but not necessarily bad. And then when he goes and he gets his new contract, he immediately dies. Which I guess is supposed to be God being like, don't screw with me. but I'm not really sure. I'm really unclear of what the moral message of this story is supposed to be, or what I'm supposed to take away from it. I was really enjoying it, and I was really interested to see where it went, and then it just kind of ended. Um, so that's the first story. The second story is called The Street Singer, and it's kind of even more puzzling than the first. Um, the basic story is there's a guy who sings in the streets. There's a lot of people that sing in the streets. I guess this was a thing during the Great Depression, which I didn't mention before, but all these stories take place during the Great Depression. Um, I guess this was a thing in the Great Depression where people would just go and sing in the streets and hope that people paid them money. Not even like the people that like we have now, where they go and they'll stand on a street corner and like play music and have like a bucket. It seems like they just wander to a street and then sing and hope someone gives them money, and then wander to another street and sing and hope someone gives them money. Um, so one street singer is heard by a woman who used to be a great singer and had the potential. I believe she specifically refers to herself as a diva, and had the potential to be a huge star. But she got married and it didn't really work out, so she started training other people to be singers. Uh, and then that kind of fell through because it seems like she was just in a really oppressive and abusive relationship, and her husband finally died. And so she sees this guy, and she sees her chance to vicariously be famous. Um, so she brings this guy in. They sleep together. She gives him some money and says, "Go get yourself a nice suit. And then we're gonna start training." And she's like, "It's not gonna be easy. I'm a tough teacher." So the guy goes, and he spends all of the money on booze, and then he goes home, and you discover that he has a whole family, and that he's kind of an abusive husband. Uh, it's one of those relationships where like he'll get very angry and violent, and then be like, and then the next day be like, "Hey, look, I'm really sorry about last night. I was drunk. I'm really gonna shape up. I'm gonna go get a job today," because that's what his wife nags him about, is that he doesn't have a job. So he goes out to a local bar, and the bar's like, "No, no, no, your tab is way too high. I'm not giving you any more alcohol." And he goes, "No, you don't understand. I'm going to be huge and famous. I'm going to go, and this woman's going to train me, and I'm going to be huge and famous, and I'm going to return to my family, and I'm going to have all this money." Uh, and then the bartender says something about, the street uh, where she is, and he realizes he didn't write down the address. And all of the streets look exactly the same, and he can't find where this woman is. And the story just kind of ends with him walking around singing through streets, hoping that she'll hear him. Um, it's very strange. There's a part earlier in the story, right after he leaves, where the woman gets on the phone with an agent, and she's like, "You owe me. I have this guy. He's really talented." And then she kind of starts breaking down and crying, and she's like, "This is gonna be my only chance. So much of my life has been wasted." And then when he agrees, she immediately snaps out of it, which suggests that she's just kind of being manipulative. And I thought that was really interesting. I thought this entire setup was really interesting, and then there's nothing. Like, it felt like it was the beginning of a story, and he had like a page count, and so he just ended it. Um, this whole story feels like setup. It feels like the introduction of characters to a story, but then we never get that story and we go and have this "Oh Henry" ending. Again, I'm left really kind of confused and like not sure what I'm supposed to be getting from the story. All of the artwork in this book is very cartoonish in the way that Will Eisner is, and I don't mean that derogatorily, but in that very expressionistic, cartoony style of older artists. But this book is really grimy, and I don't want to say cynical, but like it's almost like there are no good people in this book. Um, and that's almost the point. I kept waiting for, I don't know, like the moment where like there was a person that was good and there kind of aren't any. Um, and I think that's part of what's strange about these stories is, I mean, you can tell stories about bad people, or about not nice people or unpleasant people, but there's no resolution to these stories, so I'm just kind of left with this weird, unpleasant feeling of, oh, well, they were terrible people, and I guess they got what they had coming? I'm not really sure. Specifically with the woman that finds him, I think she's manipulative and not a particularly good person because of the phone call. That seems to be what that scene indicates, but we never come back to her. So I don't know. I don't know if I'm supposed to be like, yeah, she was just going to use him, so she got her comeuppance too. I'm really not sure. Uh, I don't really know what this story is saying. Um, it's it's interesting and it's a good setup. Like I was interested by the setup, and then it ended, and I was like, oh, that wasn't a setup. That was the story. I don't really know how to feel about this. The third story is about the superintendent named Mr. Scuggs. Now, right off the bat, I just want to say I had like two or three more pictures from the story, but basically the second half of the story takes place in Mr. Scuggs' apartment, uh, and his walls are lined with nudie pictures. Um, and even the pictures I took where I thought there was nothing like objectionable in it, there would still be like in the corner of a panel, like you could see like a woman's breast with a nipple, and so I didn't want to s- step over the line of geekvolution, or maybe more importantly, I didn't want some like wise guy on YouTube to be like, this is inappropriate content. So I had more pictures, uh, but I couldn't use them. So this story again is is like the others, where it's about bad people, and I'm not really sure what the point of the story is. Um, Mr. Scoggs is a really mean and nasty superintendent. He doesn't ever like uh, turn the heat on in the winter. He's really mean to everybody, and then he goes to fix something in someone's apartment, and they have a young daughter, and they kind of give each other a look. And he goes downstairs to his room, uh, and he masturbates to all of these, nudie pictures he has all over the walls. And then she comes down, and she's like, if you give me like X amount of money, like it's like a penny or like 5 cents. I can't remember what it is, but it's depression money. Um, she's like, if you give me a nickel, I'll give you a peek. And she lifts up her dress, and then she puts it back down. And he's like, okay, well, if you come back, like, I'll give you more money. Or something like that. And then she leaves and says she's going to tell everyone. And so he chases after her, and she runs away all scared, and he's chasing after her, and everyone assumes that he's being like a creepy pedophile and is trying to kill her or rape her or something. Um, and then he goes inside and kills himself. Uh, and then there's a sign that says like new superintendent wanted. I don't know what the point of this story is. Like, if he was a like if he was like a if he was like a guy that just kind of always seemed cranky and wasn't super nice, and then he got framed, and he knew there was no way out, and he killed himself. Like, that's a story. But here, he's this cranky old guy who doesn't like anybody, and does in fact look at a young girl, and then gets in trouble for it, and then he kills himself, and I don't know what I'm supposed to get from that. And, like, he doesn't seem like a pedophile because his room is plastered with adult naked women. Um, so the fact that he would want to see this, I think she says she's 9. Maybe she's 12. But she's a little girl. She's not like 16. Where like she's developing and like she looks like a woman. And like that would be a story if she was like 16 and he thought she was like an adult, and made a mistake, and then there were consequences. Like, again, that would be a story. Here, I'm not gonna say he gets what's coming to him, because like she kind of scams him, but there's nothing redeemable about him or her. I'm not sure what, like, maybe it's he's supposed to be an unlikable jerk, and look how awful he is. He'll look at this little girl lifting up her dress, and the little girl is using that to get rid of him, so hopefully they get a nicer superintendent. I don't know. This book's weird. It's like I said, like it's really seedy, uh, and not in a way like it. You can see a lot where Frank Miller gets his influence from Will Eisner. Frank Miller's made it very apparent that Will Eisner is a huge inspiration on him, and you can see it in the art. And here I can kind of see it in that everyone's kind of unlikable, except Frank Miller doesn't make everyone unlikable. Frank Miller usually tends to have one or a couple of characters that, while still kind of bad people in certain respects, are the heroes of the story. You know, they're not the best people, but they're not as bad as the bad guys. With all of these stories, I don't know what I'm supposed to be getting from any of the characters. It's very strange. The last story is called Kukulin? Kukulin? I'm not really sure. One of the biggest problems I had reading this book is it's like 30% in Yiddish. And I can pick up some of that stuff, but a lot of the names are very, very Jewish, which makes sense. I mean, it's a story mostly about Jewish people in depression, but they also all speak Yiddish, and some of those words I'm like, I don't like. A lot of Yiddish you can get from context. And some of this, like, I could figure out from context what the word meant, but I couldn't begin to pronounce the word. So Kukulin, I'm not. I think it's Kukulin. This story is probably the one that feels the most like a full story, and it doesn't really have a resolution, but it feels more like the kind of story that doesn't have a resolution. Because it's kind of a window into a bunch of people's lives for a period of time. So, like, it makes sense that there is an ending because life doesn't have an ending. I would have thought, if I'd known that this book was about a bunch of different people in a tenement building, I would have thought that this story is what the whole thing was. Again, not realizing that, it's multiple stories. This is about a bunch of different characters kind of circling each other, but never really connecting. So, the way it opens is actually really, really cool. Where we essentially play a game of telephone, from one character to the next character to the next character to the next character in some way. So, like, you'll be introduced to a man and his wife and their family, and the man will go to work. and then focus will shift to the woman who's being a telephone operator, and then it will follow the telephone conversation to the other side, and then shift focus to another person. Um, and so like that's kind of how we get our cast. Is like these people are all kind of orbiting each other in their regular lives, and then they all go to, not all of them, um, a lot of these people end up going to this farm ranch hotel. This is one of those things that feels very cultural or very dated. Not dated, but very of the time. Where like I don't really have a point of reference for this, but it's so weird I can't possibly imagine that Will Eisner invented it. Um, it's a it's like a big farmhouse, and there's a barn, and a bunch of people come and stay there over the summer. Like I don't really know what that is, but that's where this book is set. And so we have a husband and wife, and the wife leaves and takes their kids to the farm because it's cheaper for them to stay at the farm over the summer than it is for them to all stay in the city. Um, and the husband is cheating on her with a woman in the city, and she makes a comment before she leaves, like, "Oh, you must be so happy that I'm leaving, so you can go be with your," and I'm pretty sure it's another Yiddish word, whatever she says. Um, and he is kind of happy, like he enjoys being with this girl. I'm kind of gonna talk about each of the storylines in seclusion. So he comes and visits, and he tries to have sex with his wife, and she's like, "My body is ruined. Like, why would you even want that? Like, I know that you have this other woman that you enjoy sleeping with, uh, and I'm kind of okay with that." Because he goes up there with the intention of getting a divorce. He's going to leave his wife for this other woman. And she goes, "But you're not leaving me. We're staying together because you have to support me in this family. You have made a commitment. I don't care if you spend time with this other woman. I don't care if you don't love me. But we're not getting divorced. You're taking care of us." Um, then, their oldest son, not then, like concurrently, their oldest son meets a woman who kind of makes eyes at him. Their oldest son sleeps out in the barn because there's no room for him in the house, and this woman comes out to the barn and basically says, "Hey, look, I'm a grown woman. I'm married. I like to have sex. You have not had sex, so we can kind of help each other out here. I can get off having sex, and you can, and I will teach you, and because my husband's not here." So they sleep together, and then her husband comes into the barn, and there were some really, really troubling sexual politics all throughout this book, but mostly in this story. Uh, Her husband beats her up, then they sleep together, and then everything's fine, and she leaves, and we never talk about this again. Like, it's clearly had a little bit of effect on the oldest boy that she slept with, but we don't really talk about the fact that um, her husband came in and beat her, and then she's like, "No, no, no, you know that you're the only guy for me," and they sleep together, and then everything's fine. Um, and then there's another storyline about a young man and a young woman who both go to this farmhouse with the intention of meeting a rich spouse to essentially hook up with someone that's rich. Uh, and through certain circumstances, the girl thinks the boy is rich, the boy thinks the girl is rich. Uh, and so, and when the girl first gets there, there's this kind of nerdy guy that like is talking to her, and she's like, "Yeah, you seem nice, and that's great, but you're not rich, so buzz off." Okay, so the girl and the boy are kind of on a date, and they go into the forest, and like they're kissing and stuff, and then it comes out that neither of them are rich. And then the guy goes, oh, well, that changes everything. And then he rapes her. Um, and I mean, maybe, and I'll get to that. Because it's not explicit. Because everything's cartoony, even when there are sex scenes, they're not super explicit. It's a body on top of a body. Um, but this one's kind of clothed, and like there's not a scene. Like it's like, oh well, that changes everything. He starts tearing her clothes off, and then we cut away to her walking out of the woods with her clothes all ripped, saying he raped me. Um, into the arms of the nerdy guy who's kind of taking care of her, and she's like, oh, no one will ever love me now. How could any self-respecting man ever want me because I'm tarnished? And the nerdy guy's like, well, I still love you. And then she falls in love with him, and they become a couple. And then the nerdy guy goes and confronts the guy that raped her. And there's this. Hold on, I'm gonna look it up. I should have. Okay, so I'm gonna read the dialogue exactly. Um, so he basically the nerdy guy goes up to the guy that raped her and says, like, I know what you did. Um, and he says, you might like to know that Goldie is okay. And then the guy says, that phony, to matter, a cheap secretary, a nice body, though. And then the nerdy guy says, you don't get it, Benny. You didn't even penetrate. You are sick. Benny, I mean, sexually, you need medical help. Do you understand? I'm a doctor, Benny. Believe me, I know. I don't know what that means. Like that really confused me. Like, I don't know if that means that he didn't rape her and that she just thought he did because she's never had sex, or if he couldn't get it up. Like, does it mean he's gay? And like, because of when this was written and when it's set, like that's an issue. Um, I'm just not sure what I'm supposed to get from that. Um, this story kind of has an unpleasantness to it. This whole book has an unpleasantness to it that is like a couple of things coupled together. There are certainly some like old-fashioned values that just don't line up with today. And usually I'm fine with that, and I don't have a problem with it. But in this, it's also all terrible people, so that's all it is? Like, I can look past or kind of laugh some of the questionable racial and gender politics of like the James Bond books, because I understand, like, when those books were written, those weren't radical opinions. They're a little troublesome now, but back then it wasn't as big a deal. And so there's a little bit of that with this, where I can say, like, well, I understand that some of this is just the time. You know, people have pointed out a lot that there's a lot of movies from the 70s and 80s and 60s where there's kind of rape. Like, it's kind of implied to be lovemaking, but it's kind of rape. Thunderball, James Bond kind of rapes somebody. And so, like, I understand from a historical perspective, but so much of this book is just this kind of stuff, and it's what the book is about, that it becomes really hard for me to deal with or understand or process, because it's something that feels like at the time maybe might have been progressive and thought it was, and I'm not even going to say thought, probably was pretty groundbreaking in dealing with topics that we didn't talk about. But the book doesn't have a point of view or opinion. I think that's really my biggest confusion with Contract with God is that it doesn't have like a point of view or opinion. It's just presenting events. And I know lots of people write like this, make movies like this, where like you're just kind of seeing the world. And those usually aren't my kind of things, but you add onto it these really weird, you know, historically ignorant perspectives and ideas on things, and I'm just kind of left confused because I'm not really sure what the stories are supposed to be or what is supposed to be okay and socially acceptable and what is supposed to be uh, wrong. Um, it's a really confusing book, and I really wish I hadn't picked it for my first review. But at the same time, it's historically important, and if I didn't do it, I would regret not doing it. It's kind of hard to talk about because I just I don't know what I'm supposed to be getting from these stories. So that's a contract with God. Um, Next week we'll be doing something far less dour and mature, I guess. That's I guess the other thing that's kind of interesting is that this is absolutely a graphic novel. This is a mature, adults only book that has like a very cartoony look to it. So that's it's kind of interesting. Like this feels like a book that you could maybe flip through and be like, "Oh yeah, I could give this to my kid." Do not give this to your kid. This book is not appropriate. This book is for adults. And I understand that that's part of what made this book important was that it was a full-blown for adults comic book. But next week will be something much less touchy, much less grimy, a little bit more fun. Um, but yeah, so that was a contract with God.